Hey guys, my name's Mannequin and welcome back to Mastering EDM with FL Studio. So we're continuing our mastering series, and this is going to be a lot longer than I initially thought it was because I just tried to cover the compressor and limiter in one video, and turns out that takes me 30 minutes. So we're going to try to cut this down a bit. I'm going to focus on the compressor for now, and if we end up, taking a lot longer than we initially were going to, I won't get onto the limiter today, but that'll be the next episode, and we're just going to slowly work our way down the line. Why are we doing that? Well, because despite the fact that I gave a general overview last time, you really need to get into the settings here and learn what they all do and kind of learn how to listen for that, so that you could use this appropriately. And we'll learn how to use each of the individual elements, keeping in mind the stuff we first learned in the last video, which is how they work together as a mastering chain. So, excuse me. So the idea here is that we start kind of learning the general overview from the last video, and now from here on out we're going to be getting into the various components here. And the unfortunate thing is, for some that don't like going through tons and tons of videos, we have all these to do minus the high frequency limiter. I'm just going to brush over that one. Is not going to be that much because we're really not going to use it. In fact, we're probably going to have it off every single time because this is more for acoustic styles of music than anything else. So yeah, don't worry about that much. But anyway, we have to go over all of these, and then we have to talk about, I briefly mentioned in the previous video, we have to talk about using EQ for mastering. And then we also have to talk about using a regular compressor to actually, I'm not going to pull one up because the one in FL Studio sucks for this purpose. But we also are going to learn how to use a regular compressor to put some emphasis on the dynamics in our track, because you'll find that most of these here actually just kill the dynamics. So sometimes you want to get a regular compressor and use that one to kind of bring back some of that emphasis. And the ordering would be kind of weird because of the way that limiter number 6 is a collection of plugins. It's a string of plugins. It's a chain of plugins. So the idea with getting another compressor in is usually you do the RMS compression first, then you get another compressor, stick that in there to get some of the dynamics back, then you'd go through all the limiting. But unfortunately, limiter number 6 doesn't have a way to stick a plugin in between here, so whatever. We're just gonna have to make do with whatever we have available, and we might have two instances of limiter number 6, or we might just separate out the other compressor. So anyway, that's later. Long story short, we got a lot of stuff to cover. So without further ado, let's get into this. So limiter number 6, the compressor. What do we have? So we already talked about the gain and the ratio. Nothing amazing about those. It's very simple in terms of, what it does compared to a regular compressor. It's just we have the gain here, we have the ratio here. Nothing too fancy. Keep that in mind. Caps out at 5.1 dB ratio, and then this one is it minimizes actually at 1.1 instead of just plain old 1. So you cannot go to a 1-to-1 ratio, which is no compression. It's just assuming that you'd have this off if you're going to do that. So so you can't go lower than 1.1. Just something to know. Okay, so we have the gain, the ratio, and then we have our attack, release, and then our types here, and our dry mix. And I'm going to set these all to their default. And I want to talk about two things before I get into this. And that is the first thing that I didn't mention before, and I probably should have mentioned, each of these meters here have a zoom. So that if you see here, that's 0, 1, 2, and 3. And if I click out, we have 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. So we could zoom out and kind of see a bigger scheme. And the reason we do this, if I turn this to off and I turn this one to on, is because if I go back, we could see the meters rather well right here, but if I zoom in and the cap here is at 3, everything just smashes up against the top. So for each of these, depending on how much you're mastering, you're going to need to zoom them out, or you could zoom them in to see more detail if you're doing more fine-tuned adjustment of compression or limiting. So your compressor here, you'll probably want to keep it around here so that you're not doing too much to it. So anyway, into the compressor. And the one interesting thing about this compressor is that's very different from other compressors. Well, not very different. It may show itself in other compressors as well, but this one has an interesting feature. If you have the attack at 1 here, and then you have the release anywhere before 1, the release will get locked to whatever the attack is. Actually, it doesn't. 1 isn't the spot. Basically, the release is locked to the attack if you have it less than the attack. If you have it over the attack, it behaves normally. So keep that in mind. So if you're trying to figure out which one is better here or here, you are tricking yourself, because there is no change here and here, because our attack is right here. So we cannot hear any changes until we hit 0.9, because you can see that there, 0.9. And boom, that's when we start to hear changes when we're going up and down. As we bring it lower, once again, does nothing there. So now that we know the traits of this, actually, you know what? There's one other thing I want to talk about more. We have mid-side. I covered this briefly last time. I just kind of said it compresses the mids and the sides separately. So here's the practical application of that. Your mid channel always has a lot more content than your side channels. And what that means is basically everything sounds very centered in your track. And you can make a mix that sounds very stereo. But for the most part, you have a lot more down the middle, just because that tends to be where things are. That's where your bass line is. That's where your kick is. And that's where various other things are. So why do we do mid-side? Well, essentially what it allows us to do is it allows us to compress the sides differently, which increases the stereo image. Because if you have quiet side information, then that's your stereo information. And that means you don't have a lot of that, which means that everything's going to sound dead centered. As you, if you turn this to mid-side and you turn up the gain and the compression here, or the ratio here, to increase the compression, it will compress the mid more and let the side kind of go up a bit. And that balances it out in the mathematical sense that your mid channel and your side channels are a bit closer to each other in terms of volume level. But practically what that does is it increases the stereo space. So you sound like you're in a more spacious environment when you're listening to a track. So now it's not going to be like a fix for anything. So if you didn't mix your track well and you have 90% of the stuff is in mono and you don't really have anything in stereo, it's not going to fix that. But what it will do is it will enhance it a bit. If you've done it well in your mix, then it can enhance it here. So what do I suggest? I don't know. It kind of depends. Normal is if you just want to overall do some smoothing to your to balance out your waveform here, so that we have so that our troughs are not so deep. It kind of brings them up to the level of our peaks, and then it takes these higher parts here and it just kind of levels it out in general. So I don't know, we'd have like, if we had a straight line, it'd kind of stick everything about this level or something. So so that's generally what we're doing. So that means normal is okay, but mid side will let you do a little bit more to it, just kind of enhance it a bit. So that is up to you, which you decide to use. Anyway, now that we know all of this stuff here, we could get into this. And I will briefly touch on this one button up here. But other than that, there's no other, things that we need to learn in terms of tools to use for the compressor. So, okay, so now that we're in here doing this, we have to choose how much compressor we want to do. So we have the gain right now basically at 0. I'm going to turn this up to quite a bit, and then I'm going to I have the ratio up as well. And you kind of hear what the compressor is doing as I decrease the ratio, if it'll play. So you could hear it really squashing that sound. And one of the things it does is if you listen to the reverb, you could hear how it the reverb is pulsing in and out, because the reverb is a very low level thing that is affected by the dynamics of other things such as the kick. So as the kick hits, it pushes the reverb down, and you could really hear that as we turn up the ratio. So you start to hear some weird stuff. Additionally, when we have the ratio up this high, because we have it set to mid-side here, it pulls the sides up way too high, and we actually end up losing too much of the mid channel because it's compressing it so much. If you actually zoom out here, you can see one of the 2 meters up here is always ahead of the other, and that's the red one. The red one is the mid channel. It's always going to be, well, not always, most of the time it's going to be compressing the mid channel more than the side channels. So anyway, with this much compression on, a lot of gain here and a very high ratio means that we're going to be doing a lot of compression. And what that means is that we're going to be squishing down the mids quite a bit. Now, if I set this to normal, you'll hear that it doesn't get that weird sound where it kind of like loses the mid. So it keeps the mid information a lot better, but it also pulses in and out a lot more. It sounds like it's being squashed a lot more. So that's the trade-off you have there. If you're working with mid side and it kind of sounds like strange things are happening to your stereo imaging, just switch to normal and reduce the compression. Because, you know, like I said, it's 2 different tones. Just go with what you feel will work good. There's no right one to use for most stuff. So we have that. I'm going to balance in some gain and a ratio here. So I'm just going to turn up the gain until we start to get to the point where we're hitting 0. And then I'll adjust the ratio side. It kind of sounds like we're compressing it, but not too much. Okay, so that sounds good. We're mostly just barely brushing the 0 point, and I've set this to digital clip. The output has no gain, and the ceiling is at 0. So that'll allow us to, when this light flashes here, that basically means that we're hitting 0 dB. So if you watch. So it's just kind of blinking occasionally, and for the most part, it's not hitting it too hard. So that's basically what we want for the compressor here, because our peak limiter is going to be doing most of the hard, heavy squashing. But for now, we're going to adjust the ratio. So I'm going to put the ratio about there, and there's a reason for this. As you could tell, as we went higher up, it started to smooth out the sound and kind of squash things. I'm keeping it here because at this point it's a little bit squashed. If I turn it down, it's the sound's a bit more free. But what we could do is we could dial in this dry mix to bring back some of that sound. So if you take a listen. And that brings, especially in the kick, it brings a lot of the dynamics back. So we'll take a listen to this one more time, listen to the kick, and watch how it kind of sinks back as I turn down the dry mix. Also, that pluck does a pretty good job at getting pulled forward as you pull up the dry mix. So that's what we're going to stick this about here. It basically allows us to do a little bit more compression with our ratio here, but then we put the dry mix in, and the original dynamics sit on top of the compressed dynamics, and it lets those bits that are punching through, it lets them cut through, and this ratio is going to be most of our body of the sound. So it's kind of like, you know, if you have like, for instance, if you look at this here, we have all these little peaks here, and if we actually just cut off all those peaks and made it a flat rectangle, we could add in some peaks and make it look very similar. So that's the idea here. Our flat rectangle is what happens when we compress this with the gain and the ratio here. And then when we get the dry mix here, we're basically just adding some peaks on top to give it the dynamics back. So now don't use that all the time. Don't squash it completely and then pull up the dry mix, because then you'll just get a weird sound because you're kind of having super compressed stuff mixed with totally uncompressed stuff. And while you can get some pretty cool sound off of that, you need to be very careful about it because it needs to be done deliberately. Okay, so now that we have that, we can mess with the attack and the release. And basically, it's best to start with the attack, because as you pull up the attack, once again, it pulls the release up. So we're going to do that and then take a listen here and kind of listen to where this track wants to be. Okay, I kind of like what happens when we put it about here, because if we open it up too much, then we just kind of end up with super smooth compression, and it ends up being not quite enough. But if we have it super low here, a super short attack, then we lose a lot of that information because it all gets squashed by the compressor. Despite the fact that it's a slow RMS compressor, we still want to make sure that we're still not pushing it too fast, even though it is slower than most compressors, because it doesn't bode well when you get all this information from an entire mix and compress it really quickly, because there's just so much stuff in it that it's hard for it to control. Okay, so anyway, we've pulled that up. Now finally we have the release, and I'm gonna pull that up and we're gonna listen to kind of hear where it opens up a little bit, and then we'll pull it back just a tiny bit and try to dial things in. So I'm going to drop it about here, because right here it sounds kind of squashed, but right here it kind of sounds loose. The sound doesn't sound tight enough. So I'm going to put it right in the middle there, and we can call our compression good. So I know, unfortunately, these videos have been longer than usual. This is a 17-minute video, but whatever, we kind of have to deal with that because I can't split this up any more than it's already been split up. We're just talking about the compressor right now, and it's already taken us a while. So that's pretty much all you need to do. I mean, the hard thing is, I really showed you for this track, but it's going to be hard to hear the very subtle differences I'm making. I mean, I could pull off the compressor here. Just take a listen. I'm going to A/B it with this off. But the problem is, you can probably tell, the volume level is so different, it's not really a fair comparison. Also, one of the things I mentioned is you kind of want to zoom in for this particular compressor, because you don't want to be doing too much with it. And once again, if we get over here, watch, it gets up to 2. So we're kind of pushing it more towards the end of this zoomed in version. So that's kind of the one limiter I suggest that you should probably have it zoomed in for, or the one component of this limiter, I should say. Finally, before we wrap this video up, I know it's been long, sorry. We have the compressor and limiter button here. Now, excuse me, what this does is this lets you change the order of the compressor and the limiter. It gives you the option to have the compressor first or the limiter first. And I'm telling you that this button is here now so that you know. That's what that does, and you can use that if you want. However, I will never, just because it makes no sense to me to limit something that is that limits the high end and attacks the stuff very aggressively, and then compress it with a slow compressor. It seems so backwards. It's kind of like I don't know. It's like using fine sandpaper on a rough block of wood for hours until it's finally smooth, and then you're like, okay, now I'll get the rough sandpaper to smooth things out. And it's like, wait, that doesn't make any sense because you've already sanded it down and smoothed it. So that's why I would never do it this way. There may be some reasons that you'd want to do it the other direction, Quite frankly, I don't know what they are, and the default for I think almost all the presets. I'm not sure. I'm not going to say that, but the default for a couple of the presets I've seen is that the limiter is first, and that's the one I've always used, and it just works. So, you know, I don't see any reason to switch it that much. Also, with the fact that it kind of seems counterproductive to me. So, so that's what that button does, just so you guys know. I'm always going to leave it limiter to compressor and not have it the other direction. But it's up to you. Once again, you're mastering it. You make the decision. Go by taste. You know, that's the hardest part because you have to listen. And I showed you what this particular track needed as I was listening to it. And we were kind of listening to when the ratio started hitting hard, things like that. But you might be having a completely different type of track. And let's say you're doing, I don't know, hardstyle. Hardstyle, you might want to attack it differently. Maybe you want it so that it has a little bit less dynamics. Things kind of sound a bit more crushed and rough as opposed to this being a trance track. So I want it to sound punchy and yet kind of spacious. And that's what I'm going for. So it really depends what you're trying to get. I showed you an example for this one. But like I said, you could have a completely different approach. I'm just kind of generally showing you what these things do and how we use them to kind of balance things in. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Next video, we're going to be talking about the peak limiter. Expect that one to be just as long, just because we have to go through the different types of limiters, different types of types, and then some of the things down here and add these. So we've got a lot to do next week as well. But this should tide you over a little bit knowing how compression works. So you could use this one rather well. Practice with this. Get an ear for this because it's rather hard to hear the changes you're making with this. So really listen closely and spend some time getting used to this. And once you do, the peak limiter will be much, much, much easier to work out. So that's my suggestion. In the meantime, work on learning how to listen to the compressor. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful to you guys, and I will see you in the next video.